So we're not going to delay you for lunch longer than 35 minutes at the maximum. We're going to have a Twitter-style panel where I will cut everybody off after 140 characters. We've actually heard quite a lot about this subject already this week from various people, the issue of silicon envy, or more broadly the issue of whether or not Europeans look at the US and say we'd like to be more like that. And I think that goes for the lack of big companies that people have talked about this week, and the lack maybe of entrepreneurship or a culture of entrepreneurship, or the preconditions for entrepreneurship. And we heard Yuri Milner talk about we're seeing an era of the...
I'm so sorry. We've got Gregor Vogelsang from Booz.
Yes, Gregor.
There
welcome.
we go. Sorry.
He doesn't have a nameplate, but he can introduce himself. And we heard Yuri talking about the emergence of dominant US companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, and various concerns, including James Murdoch saying this morning that News Corp was basically a rather tiny company compared with those. So I'm going to start by asking the panel, maybe Erel, to say, is there a problem? You seem to think there was a problem this morning when you talked to Neely.
Well, first of all, I think there's a major opportunity. I mean, we invest in a variety of countries, mostly connected to Israel and in the United States, and we see entrepreneurs across Europe. And I just want to say that the kind of inventiveness, ideas, new models, new concepts are amazing. So first and foremost, I think there is an opportunity. We were lucky enough to be involved in building a European company together with Israelis and together with other nationalities that became very recently a very big success on NASDAQ, which is media inside the enterprise. It's democratizing the information. And I have to say that once you're able to build it, once you're able to build a company that is across different countries in Europe, it's very strong because it's very local in England and Germany and Sweden and Holland and a variety of other countries. You're then able, when you come into the US, you're able to present a different kind of startup that most of the US startups would be. US startups would primarily be about creating an American company and then thinking about going internationally. If an Israeli startup is going to be successful, or if a European startup is going to be successful, they need to build what I call a mini multinational. But if you are successful, it's very powerful. Now, was it easy? No. Why? Because first of all, you can't give stock options to a lot of the employees because the government takes about 50 or 60% of that, while in the US they take 15. Is it easy to invest in a European company? No, because the withholding tax is about 50 or 60%, whereas when you do it in the United States, it's zero capital gains, and when you do it in Israel, it's zero capital gains. However, the culture, the entrepreneurship, the ideas are amazing. And I think that Europe needs to wake up to its entrepreneurs.
Okay, so Mike, the problem is not a cultural problem, the problem is an economic problem, is that right?
I don't want to be on a panel where we all agree with each other, but I think he's got it pretty much right.
You can start by agreeing.
But I'm going to have a go. I mean, at TechCrunch Europe, I run around. I'm very much at the coalface of entrepreneurs and startups in Europe, and I believe that the data is behind the curve, as it were. I mean, huge amounts of entrepreneurship and activity. I really implore governments and policymakers to get behind this wave. Yesterday, Yuri Milner said that if this is the era now of mathematicians, it's not about social networking, it's about maths. Well, if that's the case, then it should be the era for Europe. Out of the top 10 top coders, there's a rating system called Top Coder. The top 10 countries, out of the top 10 countries, 5 are European or Central European. And I'm talking about places like...
Is there a difference between European and Central?
No, I'm not making a distinction. I'm just saying of the European continent, and that plus the fact that I go around Europe, I go to events. I mean, 2 years ago, I walked into what I thought was a meetup in Istanbul of entrepreneurs. I thought there'd be 30 people in a bar. It turned out that they were in the ballroom, and it was 400 people. 2 years later, it's 800 people. In Kiev, I've just been to a conference. 2 years ago, it was 20. They just did an event for 700 people. So there's a huge wave of entrepreneurship out there. And but the venture capital industry is now withdrawing largely towards later stage deals. And it's really behoves business angels now to get behind the program.
Okay.
If you have a £20,000 car, then stop buying a car and invest in an entrepreneur and a startup.
Okay, well, we've got Esther, who's, if she doesn't mind me saying so, a veteran of Silicon Valley. So nobody could be more expert in coming from Silicon Valley to here and saying, what's the difference? What is the difference?
Yeah.
Is it what people have been talking about?
Well, actually, I went even farther than here. I went all the way to Russia. And to some extent, I'm going to speak for that region, which doesn't get as much voice. But I think the issue is cultural, and I think to some extent it's not a lack of entrepreneurship. It's a lack of the ability. Anybody can start a 5-person company, and there are lots of people who want to. But then when you want a CFO, when you want a middle manager, when you want someone to run shipping or customer relations or something like that, it's very, very hard to get those people, because those people, they're not the entrepreneurs, and they've been told by their mothers they should go work for SAP or for Coca-Cola or for some big brand. So it's the ability to build the company once you've done the startup. The second issue is, someone mentioned employment regulations. It's not just employment regulations, it's Europeans take vacations. And I have a guy I funded in New York. He was living in my spare apartment. Then I had to kick him out because I had another entrepreneur I'd promised that spare apartment to first. And now this guy's living on a sofa in the office. People, when, this is of course a generalization, but Europeans think to risk everything means that you don't have any spare cash. It doesn't mean you mortgage your home, et cetera, et cetera. One is not necessarily better than the other, but one is more successful
So
in
is then
doing a startup.
the cultural problem that people are inventive, they've got the skills, but they lack the recklessness?
Well, no, they don't. The skills are not there from 10 people to 1,000 or
Right.
10,000. That's the real challenge. And it's also the lack of angel investors or VCs. Money is relatively easy to get. Right now, in fact, it's probably too easy to get. And so one problem for a startup is you've got 10 guys doing something similar next door.
Right.
But what you don't have is a VC who'll give you anything more than money, who has time to spend, advice to give, help you find the middle management you need.
I was very struck this morning by Nelly talking about GSM and the way in which that was actually a triumph of European regulation, effectively. They said you've all got to be on the same bandwidth, you've all got to have a common standard. For a time, Europe was ahead in mobile, and then suddenly the app revolution, the centre of gravity seems to have shifted. I'm going to ask Gregor then, are there things that the European Union and governments can do to just change the situation? Is it tax policy? Is it regulation? Is it getting out of the way? What is it?
I'm not sure whether it's just sort of the regulation. I mean, as you were talking about Russia, as you may have read in the press, we're actually helping the Russian government right now to build kind of a high innovation zone in the vicinity of Russia.
Yeah, but you have to
of
cultivate.
Moscow. And actually, I mean, I think we're always coming back to the points that were already raised here. If you look at Silicon Envy or trying to rebuild Silicon Valley in Europe, there are three things that really need to come together. One is you have to have a sense of rivalry and aggressiveness ingrained in the culture, and that is certainly lacking in many of the European cultures. The second thing is you need smart capital. I'm not talking about venture capital or private or whatever, angel business capital.
It could also be venture capital, right?
It could be. Smart. It could be, yeah, but it has to be smart capital in the sense that it doesn't provide just capital, it provides networks, it provides know-how, it provides links, etc. And then another thing that is obviously quite often lacking is the education system not being geared towards producing products or things or businesses, but it's geared towards producing papers and academic stuff. And that is obviously, I don't frankly think that we should look too much to the European Commission or the government's regulation and blame, everyone that's above us. It's really grassroots stuff that you have to do to make this work. On the other hand, I just want to also remind people that there are very, very successful businesses in Europe, and they thrive internationally.
We'll talk about that actually.
Okay.
Jonathan, you're making the point, I think, when we were talking before, that actually in terms of professional businesses as opposed to consumer businesses, there's some pretty big European ones.
Exactly. I mean, there are global media leaders in Europe, and they are all companies that in the last 15 or 20 years decided to get out of consumer businesses, because consumer businesses by their nature are intensely local, because the cultures are intensely local, the advertisers are intensely local, and the like. And it's more fun to be global. And if you're going to be a media company and based in Europe, you have to pick a niche that is narrow, that goes globally, which is professional markets. So Reed Elsevier, Pearson, Wolters Kluwer, V&U for many years. That's what they did. They took their portfolio, which was a mix of consumer and professional. They said, well, if I'm the biggest consumer women's magazine publisher in Holland, that's great, but where else can I go? I can sell them to somebody else and then become the global leader in marketing information services. I don't think people should focus on trying to become pan-European or global as such. I think what you want to do if you want to make money is to find a space, a defined space, and dominate it. And in Europe, often in the consumer world, that means your own country. And that's actually a good thing. And in fact, the world has become less global, not more global. That's why all the big media companies who are in Europe have become much more local in the content they have to produce and the nature of the businesses that they're in.
Sure,
so to
but
the
this
extent
isn't
they're
going
global,
to
they're multi-local.
produce the next Twitter or Google.
I noticed my panel member next to me shaking his head, which is always a good sign on a panel when somebody starts disagreeing. So, Erel, why is he talking rubbish?
Well, no, not rubbish, no, by all means. But I think that
Why is he? What he's saying, European companies should be modest. They should be local. They should stick to their
Well-behaved.
well-behaved.
Oh my
saying they
goodness,
should
be modest. In the technology field, be modest and try to conquer the world. I don't think so. I think that one of the issues is that some of these European countries are too big to begin with. So if you have a French entrepreneur, they would do wonderfully in France. They would have 4 French VCs around them. They would all speak French in the board, and they would be the leading. They could often be the leading company in the category, but they would think of going abroad or going to the U.S. about 2 years too late because they think it's too expensive. No. What do we have in Israel that a lot of other countries in Europe don't have? We have a small country. We have no domestic market. We have to be international from day one. We have to create a DNA in some of these companies with entrepreneurs from other side of the world and not call them foreigners, and not have a colonial model of a company. What's a colonial model? Where you have the headquarters in one part of the world and all the rest of the countries sort of bow down to the main
Okay,
country.
but this is an interesting point. We do actually have an example in Scandinavia of countries that
because
have
it's a
produced.
small country.
They've produced
Estonia.
Skype. They're producing Spotify. What is it? What's the magic sauce in Sweden?
English. I mean, I really think language is a much bigger issue than country when you're talking about software and internet services. Someday it might be Spanish or Chinese, but right now the English language lasted a lot longer than the British Empire. And I think in the same way, English will persist even if America's really crappy education system catches up with it.
Right, and is there anything else about Sweden?
It's small.
I think that there's a huge amount to do with education. The link between, if you look at the Google guys, I mean, they came out of, they were at Stanford, and they spun out this little thing that they had, a little project called Google, did it, and rented a garage, and off they went. And I think
With money from an angel investor.
Exactly.
And
with
one
money
of them
from
was
their
Russian.
access to capital, Silicon Valley, every auntie, uncle, your neighbor is a VC, a banker, an entrepreneur, and the network in Europe is so disparate. However, I mean, there are people out there, Lars out there in the audience who are doing Hack Forward, a startup program. There's Seed Camp now. There's lots of programs now bringing the entrepreneurs together across Europe and networking people. Twitter is bizarrely, hilariously useful as a way to find other entrepreneurs in Europe. It's like planes flying above cloud now and finding each other. So but this is only happening in the last 5 years. Silicon Valley has been doing this for 50 years. They produced the Manhattan Project. They produced the military-industrial complex. So, give us a break here. We've only been doing this for a short time.
Yeah, I would agree, and also I would disagree with the fact it's language or size of the country. I mean, look at Germany or...
By the way, Gregor,
France.
I think you should introduce yourself. You're a mystery man. You're from Booz, is that correct?
I'm from Booz. I lead our media business in Europe.
Excellent.
But I would argue Germany, the Mittelstand is fine, but it's not produced to Twitter or anything like that.
But I also want to say that there's a change that's happening in the venture industry in general and the high-tech industry in general. Up until recently, the way you created companies was an engineer was going to meet an engineer. A lot of them came from the defense space, and this is how you created companies, because the revolution that we catered had two major gods, the communications god and the enterprise god. We have a new master. The new master is the individual. The individual needs applications to be creative on a variety of levels. So a lot of the new companies that are being created are not just about engineers. It's about a storyteller meeting an artist, meeting an engineer.
Yeah.
Think about an animated film. The only way the magic happens is that the three of these disciplines meet in a good way. So why is that an opportunity for Europe? Because Europeans, unlike empiricist Anglo-Saxons, are more conceptual.
Yeah.
And I think that the time has come for conceptual companies that are coming from the merging of other disciplines of thought.
Absolutely.
And a lot of these companies would reside in the big cities.
Let's just talk...
That's, I think,
Sorry,
is a very important point, if I may say. This big cities point that you're making, I think the bird's nests of the future are big cities. If you look at Berlin, Berlin is not a German city anymore. It's a city vibrant of software producers. And the other thing is, some things have to come luckily together. I was in Peking a month ago or so, and I met a private equity guy from the States. His only job was actually to go around the universities and speak to the students and see whether they have good ideas. Yeah, this is what I meant with grassroots stuff happening without governments, regulations, etc. caring. Yeah. Language barriers don't matter. The thing is, a couple of things coming together, and then you have a spark, and that can happen actually anywhere in the world.
Let's just talk about venture capital for a minute, because people complain about or say it's just not the same as Silicon Valley. And yet there are venture capital firms, there are private equity firms in Europe. A lot of them, the American ones, have come here. So why isn't it happening in the same way?
Well, if you look at some of the latest data, there's in the third quarter of 2010, was the lowest amount of deal flow in the last 10 years amongst VCs. So what that reflects really is that these fund sizes are built really for a different era, for a boom era, as opposed to a much more product-oriented, iterative, low, lean startup era, which is really where we are now, where you use open source tools, you use virtual, your team is on Skype and on Twitter and whatever, you're spread across the planet. So it's much cheaper now to do startups, which is why I'm imploring everybody to really look at that sort of much earlier stage. And so the VCs are less involved.
And they simply have too much overhead to fund the startups now, and so they're waiting for things that are at the 20, 30 million stage so they can get a return, and at the same time, there's too many of them, and so they're not going to get those returns, many of them. I mean, we've seen a lot of buyouts or takeouts over the last half year, where Slide is one example. There's bunches of others. They don't typically say how much they sold for, but it's often for less than was invested.
Well, I don't necessarily agree. I think there's a lack of early stage venture capital that is focused on early stage entrepreneurs. I think that calling everything private equity and talking about later stages if it's venture capital, that's not the case. I mean, I'm looking for VCs that are passionate about young entrepreneurs, the ones that you're meeting in Istanbul and in Germany and some other places, and creating the environment. And if you look at most of the European countries, at least, I don't know Eastern Europe so well, but the ecosystem is not fostering those cultures. And governments are asking, what do we need to do in order to get startup economy again?
But you have to stand back and say, well, look at the returns of venture capital firms, because there is actually a distinction between venture and private equity. They both dramatically, as a class, underperform just putting money in the stock market, but the venture firms as a group underperform even more. And if they,
Not
if
the
as a
top- not the
class,
top
if
quartile.
as a, yes, if you only, guess what? If you only invest in the top quartile, you do well. But as an
Find
asset
it.
class, if as an asset class, you dramatically underperform the market, and you say, the problem is that there's not enough money going into it, that's a little curious. That is, there's obviously something else wrong here. Why
Well,
aren't,
but in the
Could I also
90s,
draw
we
your attention to something else?
overperformed. In
It's
the
not-
90s, we overperformed.
so if you
and-
pick the right years and the
no,
right
wait.
funds,
But wait a
you're-
minute.
you're golden.
If you put $1 on NASDAQ, you lost 60% in the last 10 years. So the entire effort was at a time where there were 2 tsunamis in the world economy. It doesn't mean, first of all, the top quartile are still overperforming. And the second thing is
that's why they
that
call them
look,
top
but
quartile.
look forward at those VCs that are still there, still passionate.
You'll be shocked to know the bottom quartile underperforms.
And many of those VCs are now doing green tech.
Can I just draw your attention to another fact which I think is important? Don't necessarily look only at sort of the VC seed capital stage. Also look at what's happening at the exit end. And there is a lot of things happening that are not good.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the
As I
big
said.
players that have been active in, taking up the inflow from that VC space have actually closed down, or they have said, look, anything that's below 10 million euro profit, I don't care.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and meanwhile,
This is the end.
Sorry.
This is the end where things are right now, I think, bottling up significantly, and I think there's a big danger.
Well, that's
for
interesting in
Right.
relation to Yuri Milner, because he went and did late stage in the US,
Right.
effectively, didn't he?
I think
But-
the exit. Yeah, sorry.
and now you have Google and Facebook basically buying companies in order to get the CEO, laying everybody else off, and certainly not repaying the investors.
And I think the ecosystem in the valley where you acqui-hire, in other words, you buy a company effectively to hire the staff. There's less of that in Europe. I mean, I'm part of a project called Tech Hub in London, and the sponsor of that is, one of the sponsors is Google, not a European company, not SAP, not Autonomy, Google, because they want to hire engineers, they want to find people, they want to become part of the scene and, find Android developers, etc. So, yeah. So the ecosystem of, exits for smaller or medium stage companies is, there's less exit opportunities.
I guess the big picture point I was trying to make is government regulation is important, but if you really want to attract money into this sector, you got to show that you're going to get reasonable returns. And my view is part of why the returns haven't been as well is people have had, for venture businesses, too grand ambitions. That is, I want to be Skype, I want to be the next Google. I think actually it would be good if people invested in 4 French guys who are going to own the French market, because those businesses are going to have higher ROI. And if it makes sense to replicate it and be multi-local later, that's fine. I think the overall returns would be higher if people had their sights a little lower, and if you have your sights a little lower and the returns are higher, more money will come in. But if all the money is going to, I'm going to take over the world, you're going to keep having bad returns, and then nobody's going to give you money.
I disagree. In order to make venture returns, you need to be focused on 50 times your money with a company. If you don't have home runs in the venture practice, you have no
Right.
business being in the practice.
And many people don't have home runs, which
Okay.
is
That's the
fine.
point.
So-
The point is
so
that the
they shouldn't be
middle
in the business.
quartile underperforms. That's the problem.
But there's also people that are making good returns. And they have, in order to make good returns, in the venture business, 80% of the returns are from 5% of your companies.
But you're from Israel, right? I mean, wouldn't, if you had capital that's only focusing on sort of 50 times, I mean, I think many of the ventures that we see in Israel, and I've seen many there, wouldn't be there.
But most of the companies would not do 50 times.
Okay.
But
we're
if
gonna-
you're not ambitious, you're not going to
Okay,
get
guys, it's a good argument, but we're going to open it up to
Yeah.
the floor and ask for some questions in 1 minute. And I'm going to ask a question before I pick that. Sounds to me a little bit from some of the things people are saying that it's, as Donald Rumsfeld would say, it's a problem of old Europe and new Europe, that on the borders of Europe, in Russia and Eastern, and maybe Scandinavia's the border, things are going fine, but Germany, France, maybe the UK, perish the thought, things are all very stultified. Is that right?
Fine, no. I mean, fine is not exactly what it is in Russia. But the great thing about Russia is that your competition faces the same problems. And Central Europe is probably the best place to come from because they are too small. And as several people have said, if you have a large home market, you don't really think beyond those borders. Again, I think the English language is tremendously important. Most of the techies read and write English. Some of them don't speak it quite so well. In Central Europe, people did have fathers and uncles and sometimes mothers who were in business, whereas in Russia they didn't. But there's a lot more willingness to risk there than there is in Western Europe, where people, life is comfortable. Why should we do this?
No, I think also, I mean, in Britain, the top tax rate is now 50%. And stop me if I'm wrong, but I think in Russia it's something like 12. And
Yeah.
so that,
And it's discretionary.
let's not go
Extremely
there.
discretionary.
But that unleashes capital at the early stage. And I mean, the French government had a scheme recently in the last couple of years called the ICF, I think, called a scheme which allowed high net worth individuals to invest in startups as a kind of a tax break. And now they're thinking of retracting it, which is, I think, ridiculous. And so, and Ireland is going for it right now, trying to woo tech companies big time.
Well, of course, Ireland can afford it. They haven't got any economic problems. No?
Vinod Merawat from DN Capital. I've got to stand up for the European venture community for a second. So I've done venture in the US, I've done it in Central and Eastern Europe, and I've also done it in Western Europe. The market today is better in Western Europe than it's ever been in the past. If you look at exits, you talked about exits, Playfish, European company, Skype, MySQL, Bebo, Betfair. If you look at the per capita exits per venture capital money in Europe versus the US, actually you might see the returns in Europe in the top quartile, which is what it's all about, much better than the US. Index, which is a European firm, is moving into the US, also competing for deals. So I think it's an argument. If you look at the data, you'll find out the data is not proving your case.
Okay, that's not a question, but that's fine.
It's a little sad just if those are the right data points, more than half of them were indeed good exits to very unhappy, dumb American
Yes.
buyers. And I'm happy that...
Bebo was one of the greatest exits of all time, wasn't it?
And Skype, they obviously was sold on to somebody, and it'll ultimately do well. But if you can count, you can't count on America based on our economy to be the dumb buyers of assets that will destroy value for their shareholders forever.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look at, take that. I mean, I think the questioner was right. I mean, there is fantastically smart venture, and a European venture that concentrates on tech is often outperforms their American compadres, as it were, because they are, they're very engineer focused and things like that. If there is a criticism of European VC, often it's because very few of them have been operational, have been entrepreneurs in their own right. And this is kind of a key advantage of some Silicon Valley VCs, is that they have been entrepreneurs and have been operational, as it were. But it's changing. There is an old Europe and a new Europe.
Also, I honestly think it's a bit
tech.
of a fake argument, European versus American VCs. Obviously, a lot of the VCs are actually transatlantic, and actually some of the best of them actually know both worlds and can interact between both worlds.
Okay.
Yeah, but they all have, the ones that do have incredibly local teams. There's nothing,
Yes.
Okay.
nothing
Yeah.
worse than...
Okay. Okay.
You're right. Yeah.
Anyone's got a question? Okay. Over there.
So, Neely this morning made the observation, which is consistent with my personal experience, but I didn't hear anybody mention it on this panel, that some of what drives the difference is that in Europe there's much more of a scarlet letter stamp of failure. Should it not work out? Yet those of us who do startups know the vast majority of them don't work out, especially when you count things that are sold for less than the amount of money that's in the bank, or to get the CEO, or as Esther saying, or whatever it is. I know certainly I've been able to hire people who came over from Europe for that reason. That they felt that there was just too much stigma to trying to do it in Europe because they know what the odds are. By the
Question?
same token, I would argue that in the Valley, the bar is too low. I know many people who are my age that have done 13, 14 startups who are unable to associate the outcome in terms of dollars to their pocket with the caliber of the
Okay.
company or anything else. So I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think
Yeah.
So I think that you're very right. I mean, if you look at where innovation happens in the world, it's primarily in immigrant societies. Immigrant societies are on the West Coast, the East Coast, Israel. These are people that left. You speak about the Russians. When the Russians immigrated to Israel, they've been a huge part of the booming economy. People that start new companies are people that often have nothing to lose, and people that want to go all the way. And I think you're right. I think the risk-taking element that exists in well-established societies is a little bit of an issue. And
But if that's the case, that's a council of hopelessness, isn't it? I mean,
No,
France
'cause
is
they're gonna
France is a rich country at the moment.
Yeah, but there will continue to be immigrants everywhere. France doesn't really like them, but I bet you'll see Turks in Germany and so forth will
But I
be
think-
some of the next
Okay,
generation.
so
I think
I'm
there's also a
I'm
generation.
conscious that lunch is upon us, so I'm
Can
going
I say
to.
one more thing?
Yes, you
I
can
think
say
there's a
one more thing, yeah,
generational
yeah.
shift. I mean, there's a recession. The recession has produced young people who now can't get jobs in the big corporates of Europe. The ladders have been drawn up. What do? They're reading TechCrunch, they're reading GigaOm, they're reading the Silicon Valley blogs, and they think, well, why not we do this? There are no corporate jobs anymore. There are, pensions are screwed. Let's go and do a startup. And I think it's a generational shift.
But, just one sentence for the end. Having said all that, there's a major opportunity. I mean, the new concepts that need to build in the media space are vast. The way we will do things and learn and communicate and entertain ourselves in the next 10 years will be very different than the way they are today. So guess what? There's a major opportunity, and we're looking for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, let me just echo what you said and what Yuri Milner said. The amount of really heavy-duty math we're going to need for AI, for pattern recognition, for voice recognition, for, search isn't interesting anymore. You can find everything. You need to filter it. And that's where the numerically skilled and trained people are really going to shine.
Okay, so Europe has numerically skilled, trained people who can't find a job, so it's perfectly suited to an entrepreneurial environment.
It is, because they can create their own opportunities.
And on that optimistic note, I think we'll finish.
Marvelous.
Thank you. Thank you. Lunch is upon us, and I am so grateful